I want to unpack unsigned, undrafted former five-star players because I find this part of the recruiting process to be really interesting because the ultimate goal of every recruiting site from Rivals to 247 to ESPN is not to predict necessarily collegiate success, but to predict which players are going to be drafted and in what tier. There are three, right? Five-star tier, first round, right? There's only about 30 a year. And then about 300 4 stars, right? And that's your 2 to 3 rounds, right? And then 4 to 7 is everybody else. And usually you'll see 3 and 4 stars might get a 4 to 7 round grade depending on who the analyst is and what their traits are. Height, weight, speed, ability on a football field, all of these things come into play. But the recruiting industry has been pretty good about evaluating such talent because just saying that kid's a 5-star is not good enough. That dude needs to get drafted in the first round, and it's an 80% hit rate, more or less, about being drafted as a 5-star. It was about a 50% hit rate among the current crop, right? So pretty good about establishing who the best college football players are in high school, coming into college, and then eventually being eligible for the NFL draft, right? So take a look at the 2020 rankings, and you'll go through all 30 to 32 of those and find which ones we expect in 3 years to hear their names called as we did last year, right? And then you'll have guys that totally outkick their ranking. Notably, Brandon Ayuk, who was a first-round draft pick out of Arizona State, their second such at wide receiver, and he was unrated, but he also moved around a lot and really didn't get ranked because nobody saw him play. So if you want to ding someone for giving a 2-star or giving 2 stars to an athlete that they didn't see play or who only played perhaps 2-3 games of football, but still managed to grow into a specimen and absolutely shock the world with his ability, see Josh Allen coming out of Kentucky, then yeah, cool, be that guy. But for the most part, the recruiting industry has been really good about evaluating talent coming out of high school. That said, Shay Patterson is a former #1 quarterback. And I want to unpack this because the quarterback rankings, especially at #1, ain't been so great. So this actually might be the one time where it doesn't pay to be Spencer Rattler, because going back to 2013, #1 quarterbacks as a rule just haven't been drafted very highly. Max Brown going to USC in 2013, right? 2014, Kyle Allen coming out of Texas A&M. He's in the league, but is he Cam Newton? Is he Jameis Winston? Is he Tom Brady? No, not at all. Right? 2015, you're looking at Josh Rosen, UCLA, right? 2016, talking about Shay Patterson. 2017, talking about Davis Mills. I'll bet many of y'all don't even know where Davis Mills goes to school. Stanford, right? And then we're thinking about, say, guys that we thought were going to be not just 5 stars, but first-round draft picks, and Jacob Eason didn't go that highly. Jake Fromm, 5th round to the Buffalo Bills. And I want to get into the Georgia quarterback situation in a little bit because it's bonkers when you really consider Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields both could have been Bulldogs. Trevor Lawrence before Justin Fields, because Trevor Lawrence ends up, committing a year before Justin Fields does. And Trevor Lawrence was brought in for Dog Night when Mark Richt and Brian Schottenheimer were still the brain trust over there in Athens. And at Dog Night, where they had these 3 quarterbacks competing against each other, it was Trevor Lawrence, Jacob Eason, and Bailey Hockman. Bailey Hockman eventually went to Florida State, transferred to North Carolina, and that's the last anybody heard of him. Jacob Eason, they end up going with because Schottenheimer was infatuated with him, even though the kid from Cartersville, Georgia, probably the best of the 3. Clemson got in there. He committed to Clemson. That was that. Justin Fields was the dude that Kirby Smart went after when he found out he really didn't have a shot at Trevor Lawrence. Ends up getting Justin Fields, and then you put Justin Fields behind Jake Fromm, which makes 0 sense to anybody at the time. It makes even less sense now because we're talking about Justin Fields being one of the first quarterbacks taken off the board next year and a Heisman finalist in 1 year as a college starter. So there's that. And then there's just this thing with Shay Patterson, who has to suffer not only being undrafted and unsigned as of the airing of this show, but saw 10 of his former teammates get drafted. Yo, that hurts. And it also goes to show what many folks at Ole Miss would tell you about Shay Patterson, which is that they didn't really miss him. They didn't think he was that good. And when he decided to transfer to Michigan, turns out the most important thing about Shay Patterson transferring to Michigan is that Tom Mars was able to get him immediately eligible with a waiver because he knew the language and he was so good at it that the NCAA ends up offering him a job as their top cop. That turns out to be the legacy of Shay Patterson's collegiate career, when many people would have told you that as an Elite 11 MVP, as a number one quarterback, he should be one of the first guys taken. He should be in that same conversation as Justin Herbert, let alone Jordan Love, who ends up getting taken as the heir apparent to Aaron Rodgers in the first round. And then you go down this list of former 5-stars, and what it really is either a conversation about being underdeveloped or moving around. So Keyshawn Lucier South, outside linebacker out of UCLA, former 5-star, number 16 player overall in the 2015 class. You can understand, UCLA's been a dumpster fire, especially since Chip Kelly took over. He's had about 30 guys transfer since he took over, and it wasn't as if UCLA wasn't recruiting their butt off. Like, Roy Manning brought in not just Keyshawn, but also friggin' Jalen Phillips, who was the number one player in the class of 2017. So they should have been great on defense. And for whatever reason, it just does not work, right? George Campbell IV out of West Virginia, former 5-star wideout. Didn't pan out there. But then again, when Dana ends up taking the job at Houston, guess who doesn't come with him, right? And I mentioned Shay Patterson, but talking about Levante Taylor at cornerback, Florida State. He was the number 7 player in the country in the class of 2016 and number 1 player in the state of Virginia. He should have been outstanding, but then Jimbo Fisher leaves and you get a dumpster fire that's left there. Willie Taggart can't make it work. And now one of the kids that ends up going onto the scrap heap is a former 5-star. Benito Jones, defensive lineman out of Ole Miss, another guy ends up on the scrap heap because even as he started 36 games and was really productive, he really didn't have the size that you wanted to see a defensive tackle, didn't continue to blow up. And that was as a guy that just was a straight up football player. And this is one of those where I just don't get it. It's kind of like Mason Fine or Lee Morris or even Nick Baskin to a degree. There's just a couple of guys I don't get why an NFL team didn't draft, let alone sign yet, right? And if you're looking for production, perhaps you're going to look for him because 10 starts 2017, 12 games, 29 tackles, and 1.5 sacks. He was pretty good. And then what this is you go down this list and you get to Olewole Betiku, which is his actual name. You see, he picked Illinois. So he's betting on Lovie Smith. And what we've learned is they're not necessarily going to develop you into an upper tier NFL talent, let alone get you drafted. And this was a number 15 overall player, wide side defensive end, number 2 player in the state of California in 2016. But that's it, right? We're talking about 6 guys that didn't really get looks by the NFL to get drafted at 5-star. Now, when you take into account this 3-year selection of 5-stars should be about what? 30 times 3, about 90 players. And you miss on between, let's say, 8 and 10, you still got a pretty good hit rate of guys getting drafted. That said, depending on how you feel about 5-stars, all of them should get drafted or, you know, they're players and things happen to players all the time. Of course, there's that guy out there right now who's going, well, if 5-stars are so good, how come no 6-stars got drafted? To which I'm saying, get out. I can't deal with you. I can't do it. But it also speaks to making the right decision at the right time and how important it is to not just pick a school with great pedigree, but also pick a school that you feel like you're going to be able to go through all the way. Because as we continue to go down this list and we look at some of these guys, I'm always going to be on the player side when they want to transfer, go into the transfer portal because they're trying to make a better situation for themselves. But we have some data to suggest that a transfer does not help your odds of being drafted, right? Doesn't help your odds if you're on the bench either. So it's a lose-lose. But making that decision on the front end, that's going to be best for you on the back end, is still very hard to do. But even then, just taking a look at the statistics of who gets drafted and where they get drafted from, there are some things that you just can't argue with. And if you can make it work on an academic and athletic basis, you should probably go with those things, right? So if you're a high major, high value target, let's say a top 25 recruit, you ought to only be considering about 10 schools, all right? And one of those schools is Penn State. One of those schools is Wisconsin. Of course, Alabama, LSU, Oklahoma, Ohio State, those sorts of places are going to put you in the NFL. But Wisconsin has the highest rate of players that are drafted as 3 stars. So that means they are really great at developing their talent. But I also want to get into that a bit more later in the show because I think there's some stats that really need to be sung out loud for the 3-star, 2-star recruit about their recruiting process and things like perhaps you should really be giving Boise State a look. Or if you play running back, perhaps you should really be giving Navy a look, right? Among other things. Central Florida has been pretty great here of late, putting guys into the NFL, even as everybody wants to talk about how they don't play nobody and don't deserve to be in the college football playoff. Well, they're putting out talent, man, and they're getting their guys drafted. And we'll see what this means for Mackenzie Milton. I think this is going to be a referendum on Central Florida this year because if he ends up winning the starting job, which is no guarantee because Dylan Graber will look decent enough and he's good enough to definitely start next year. If he suffers the same fate as a Mason Fine, then maybe Josh Heupel can't overcome that. And that might be a reason as to why you might think otherwise about going to Central Florida if you got a better offer to say, go to Florida. Now, I also say college football for me, especially for the kids, is about going where you believe you're going to have the most fun. So like Rob Gronkowski is a great example of this. That dude grew up in Pittsburgh, then went to Buffalo, and ends up going to Arizona for college, is a part of a recruiting class that's ranked 59th in the country and did not win a bunch of games, and yet he had a hell of a good time at Arizona, catching passes and partying hard, right? Say the same thing at Arizona State. If you think that you're going to have a good time at Hawaii, you're probably going to have a good time at Hawaii. If you just want to play football and you just want to graduate, perhaps you want to look at Alabama or Ohio State, but there's also like a really great argument for why you should not even look in the direction of Texas. That's not even Texas shade. That's just looking at the statistics here. Because the idea that their highest drafted dude this year comes in the 3rd round is unconscionable. Talking about Brandon Jones and Devin Duvernay. You know, and when you look at how they have been able to recruit and what that place prides itself on, yeah, they're doing the least with the most. And that's an even worse indictment on Texas than it is on, say, Michigan, who ought to be competing for college football playoff national championships because they put 10 guys into the NFL draft, right? Say the same thing about a couple of other places, but Florida's right there on the cusp. All they got to do is get past Georgia and the world's largest cocktail party. And that's also the reason why the Jake Fromm thing is kind of, it vexes me because that dude beat Florida every time he got a chance to start against them. But was that his offensive line, or was that the skill positions, or was that the defense? Obviously, the NFL thinks it was everybody but Jake Fromm, and maybe that's kind of the point.